It does kind of speak to the necessity of procedure, though. I mean, I did, like I said earlier, I have my copy of Mason's here, which is one of the parliamentary authorities that the legislature uses. And Pat Murphy, the chief clerk, actually signed it for me and said, "Love that you're interested in process and procedure. It matters." Because of small things that were done along the way, small, errors or slowness or delays in the handling of the process in those last couple of minutes is the difference between $90 million of public investment in local projects happening and it not happening.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
I do have my handy-dandy copy of Mason's and House rules and Senate rules ready to go.
What's Mason's?
Mason's is the parliamentary authority that the House and Senate use. So, like a lot of places will use Robert's Rules of Order. Yeah. So Mason's is kind of like the complement to that for state legislatures.
Oh, really? I've heard of Roberts, but I've never heard of Mason's. Okay. All right, we're back on the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. My guest today is Dan Thomas-Commins, who is a minor celebrity. If you've ever been to a DFL convention, he is likely the person who's been chairing that convention. Thank you for coming on today, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, John, for having me. I appreciate it.
And we're going to talk about a week after it happened here, the chaotic end to the 2024 Minnesota legislative session at the Capitol. There was lots of yelling and screaming by Republicans, chants of Mr. President and Madam Speaker, chants of USA, USA, and you're breaking the rules. People crying out, Republicans crying out as if this was the end of democracy as we know it. And so that's what we're going to talk about here today. I hope you like process conversations. That's what we're talking about here. Dan, do you need to introduce yourself in any other way? What is your affiliation with the DFL?
Sure. I, John, like you said, my name is Dan Thomas-Commins. I am I currently serve in the DFL as the Secretary for the Constitution, Bylaws, and Rules Committee, but then I also chair quite a few conventions. I think I'm set to do 13 or 14 this year that I've been either a chair or a parliamentarian at. And then I've been involved in the DFL for a very, very long time. I did my first door knock when I was in second grade in 2004 for John Kerry. And then I came back from college in 2018 and have been really involved in the CBRC stuff and party affairs stuff since then. So that's kind of been my extent of my involvement with the DFL. As far as the legislature goes, I've been paying attention to the legislature and the process there and different bills since 2013 or 14. And around that time, I also started writing a bill of my own that got passed as part of House File 3 this past year. So that's kind of been my contact with the legislature, just observing it for a very long time and maintaining connections with the folks involved and being involved both in electing local representatives and also just working with them throughout the legislative session.
Can you be my Larry Jacobs today? Because by that, I mean generic white guy spouting useless cliches and conventional wisdom. Can you be that for me today?
I can do that.
Okay. That is the bar you need to cross. Listeners, I'm going to play audio of the chaos at the legislature just briefly here to give you a flavor of what happened.
Mr. President, there's a motion in front of the body, and I've requested absentees. There needs to be a voice vote, Mr. President, on that motion.
The Secretary will close the roll.
Mr. President, point of order.
There being
Mr. President, point of order.
Under Rule 41.
Mr. President, point of order. Mr. President, point of order. Mr. President, point of order. Mr. President, follow the rules.
We have rules.
Follow the rules.
Mr. President.
Mr. President, follow the rules. President!
We will not stand for this.
Mr. Point of Order!
Mr. President, under Section
Mr.
581,
President!
you as the President.
And it went on like that for 25 minutes. I couldn't believe it. I do not watch the action at the Capitol. It was the 11th hour. Bobby Joe Champion is up there running the Senate. And what struck me tech-wise is, why can I not hear anything he is saying? I can only hear the Republicans. Like, isn't Bobby Joe Champion in charge at that point? Why can I not hear him?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what the setup is like there that means that you can't hear him, but at least for them, they're screaming at the top of their lungs, and he's probably just speaking at a regular talking volume into the microphone, if he's saying anything at all. It's hard to tell, even if there's even anything proceeding underneath all that. Yeah, it's just like, I mean, and I think Kurt Dowd actually observed on Almanac that we're like one of the only legislatures in the country that has open microphones for every single one of its members, that they can just immediately flip a switch, put a mic into their mouth, and just immediately get heard everywhere, either on broadcast or in the chamber.
Are they amplified in the room? I assume they are, right?
Yeah, they are. And I forget, there is some thing that happens there where they can like turn up or turn down specific microphones, and the chamber ended up actually getting turned down. I remember, because I was there on the night that it happened, and we were standing outside the Senate chamber because the galleries were full, and we were in the hallway there with the TV screen, and we were all like hunched around, like getting really, really close to the TV because everything was super quiet. We're like, what's happening? We can't tell anymore. We have the thing already turned up, but Senate Media Services had to actually turn down the volume of the chamber that was being broadcast. So they had that level of control over it. But other than that, it was just a complete pandemonium from that perspective.
So to start this from a city of Minneapolis perspective, one of the criticisms of the city council has been, you guys caused this by bringing up the Uber Lyft thing. Like, the legislature had to deal with that on Saturday. It took up so much time. Legislature couldn't get to other stuff, and therefore it went down to the wire, and we couldn't do all this other stuff. But from my perspective, it kind of felt like they were letting it. The DFL was not moving necessarily with much urgency towards the end. And it didn't have to come down to the 11th hour. I saw some of your tweets, and you're like, well, we have this much time left, this much left to go to. They need to be picking up the pace. Were they moving with enough urgency towards the end?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with the floor time management there. It seemed like there were things that could have been done to try to move things forward. It's probably also a symptom of perhaps some confusion between communication between the Senate and the House about what's going to get passed and what bills do we have, what deals do we have, what agreements do we have to vote on these things. Because, I mean, we heard it with the ERA that Speaker Hortman said on Thursday before session ended that she understood that the Senate had the votes to pass it, and that she wouldn't have, she said on Saturday or Sunday after the session, that she wouldn't have brought it up on the floor for 15 hours debate if she had not thought that the Senate had the votes to pass it. And then if it dies at the last minute because somebody reneges on that deal, or that message was not actually true, then that signals some pretty strong communication issues between the two caucuses about what are we actually going to move forward, what is actually going to go through. So it's not just the caucuses within themselves, it's not just the DFL versus the Republicans, it's also each of the chambers not being sure what's going to move forward and how fast they can move on it. At least that's how I'm reading that situation. So the time management thing, like you're saying, is, especially in that last week there, it seemed like there's things that should have been moving a little bit faster, or things that could have been done to at least sort of shot across the bows. We're not going to tolerate this level of delay and distraction, because that was happening all week. And I know that in 2007 through 10, when the DFL was in charge in the House, and Tony Surge had to move a couple of times, had to move the previous question after certain agreements that had been had with the minority about how much time something was going to take had been abrogated, to basically say, you need to work with us in order to get your folks heard if you want to speak about these things. So if that could have been done a few more times, or a little bit more routinely. That's probably part of it, but also it's probably just the background stuff that we weren't necessarily seeing that was delaying things, just the confusion of communication.
I want to talk about the Republican complaints, their process complaints next, but is it just human nature? If you give someone a deadline, they will work to that deadline. Any amount of time will inevitably be used up, and there's no way of avoiding this. Does it always go down to the last? Is there any way to finish it the day before? I made a joke. Set an alarm on your phone for the day before at midnight. Pretend that is your deadline. Is there no way, human nature-wise, to do that?
Yeah, I do that myself. I'm one of those who works right up until the deadline, sometimes over it, much to the pain of anyone who is expecting anything from me. But I think with the legislature, there have been times in the past when they have finished early, and that was in 2014. Again, last time we had a trifecta. The problem with finishing early, though, was that there was a lot of stuff that was just left on the agenda, a lot of stuff that was left on the field, things that we just decided to kind of throw our hands up at and say, well, it's too complicated. We can't get, one person of this caucus can't support it, and so we have to essentially let it go. A lot of stuff that got brought up this session, a lot of stuff that was, for example, like payday lending reform got sidelined at that time. There were a lot of things that really, really were left undone. I think transportation didn't get done that year either. There were a lot of things that should have happened in that cycle that didn't. And so even though they finished early, what actually happened? That's the main question. So there is kind of the trade-off there. They did pass a reform this year to change what constitutes a legislative day. There were a couple of times this past week, or the last week of the session, where the House and the Senate did not meet and did not schedule floor time. The reason for that was that they were out of legislative days. You're not only limited between the window of time that you can meet in the Constitution, you're also limited to 120 legislative days over the biennium, over the 2 years. And statute had defined a legislative day as any day that either the House or the Senate meets on the floor. So if one chamber meets and the other one doesn't, that's a legislative day. And they have to count that against their total. They've changed that now so that the sort of pro forma sessions, the ones where they're just pushing paper, don't count toward that. Instead, it's things that are more substantive business that count toward that. So they can now prioritize those legislative days for actually moving things through the chambers and progressing legislation more so than just shuffling paper.
So why do these rules exist limiting? Why is there a deadline? Why is there a limit on the number of days you can be in session? It seems fundamentally conservative. We don't trust the legislature to be operating for longer than this period of time. We're going to set a time limit and kick them out. Do you know where this comes from historically?
Yeah, so we have a part-time legislature, which has been something that a lot of folks have talked about. The idea being that you don't have somebody who's in only sort of employment and only work is legislating, that they should be at least in some way involved in their community, doing a regular day job, that this shouldn't just be a way to make a living, that you should have some sort of basic background, a career outside of the politics that allows you to then represent and gain those valuable perspectives in the legislature. Some states, I think one of the Dakotas, has a session that's only 1 year and only just a few days in that, and they get everything done in 1 year versus 2 years. Other ones do the full-time legislature, year-round legislature. That's been floated a couple of times here, but we've just never gone for it. So that's been kind of where those sit, and that's why we have that sort of window there. I'm not sure how much appetite there is to move those windows because, of course, right after that window is the state convention for both of the major parties, and then you're into primary season. So just from an electoral standpoint, I don't necessarily see that changing too much, perhaps at least in the second year of the biennium. But yeah, I don't know why else the deadline necessarily exists there. It's just because of that idea that I think it may have something to do with the Jeffersonian idea of agrarian virtue, I guess. And I think that probably comes from that particular time period of thinking.
Get back to the farm. So when the GOP, when Republican senators are chanting USA, USA, let's play a little sound.
This is what happens when you treat people so unfair, Mr. President. You and the Democrat leaders.
Tell me why they're wrong. I understand Minnesota protects the minority party more to a greater extent than in other places, but like, why are Republicans full of it when they act like victims there at the end?
Yeah, I think that, I'll be honest, I think the only reason that they're that mad and that vocal is because they realize the jig is up, that their little game didn't work. Their game of just delaying to stop the agenda. And the reality is that when you're in the minority, you have the right to scrutinize the government, as in the governing party. You have the right to scrutinize. You have the right to hold them accountable to the different avenues of feedback that the public have to give, and say, here's what they're doing, here's how it can be better, and try to work with them to get the minority's priorities through. What the minority doesn't have a right to do is to just lay down on the tracks and just stop things. In no concept of government is that allowed. This is not a football game where one side is trying to move this direction, the other one's trying to stop them and be a brick wall to them. That's not how government should work. But that is how you have a difference in the way that the Republican Party has changed fundamentally, where you have folks who are comfortable with government grinding to a halt and think that that's a perfectly fine state of affairs, that we don't really need to do anything. Never mind all those projects that were in that bonding bill at the end. Never mind all the $90+ million of jobs that would support, that of local projects and infrastructure in their communities that would support. If it stops, that's good. It's just a zero-sum game in so many ways. That's not just Republicans. I will say it's kind of politics overall, but I mean, that's the biggest reason why they're annoyed. As far as the rules go, there really is like no constitutional right of anyone to necessarily speak on things that are being debated, especially not ad infinitum like they had been. They had spoken about these things. That's the thing about the report that came out in the tax committee. The tax bill conference report had one change in it, and it was the A24 amendment. I was in the conference committee hearing when it was held. It was a 10-page amendment that you could just speed read through and go, all right, this is this, this is this, this is this. That's it. Everything else, all the other bills that got rolled into it, were all conference committee reports that had completed their business, as in they had agreed the positions between the House and Senate. These were reported. So while that one conference report may not have been available, all of the other ones that were listed in that report have been available, had been debated, had been even sometimes passed through one house or the other, where they debated them for hours and hours and hours. So it's bizarre for them to say that, oh, we didn't see this, we didn't have a chance to have our voice heard. They very much did, and they decided to use their time talking about hamburgers.
Every time I pulled up the YouTube feed for either the House or the Senate, which was a lot, because I was very curious about, are we going to get this 2040 plan fix happening? And we eventually did, but I was tuning in a lot. And as someone who does not hardly watch at all, other than like clips on the news occasionally, nothing of substance was being discussed. There was the legalities of eating beaver guy. Just a bunch of Republicans talking about like stream of consciousness. I'm just here to take up time. And I saw like people list out the number of hours on each bill that had debate. And at no point did I tune in and hear like a substantive complaint. No, it goes back to my earlier question, like, why did Democrats even let those debates go on as long as they did? I assume it's because they weren't ready themselves to move on to the next thing, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. And the other reason I think is also just that the reaction that you saw is not uncommon. Speaker Hortman cut her teeth as a Speaker pro tem in the 2007 to 2010 sessions of the legislature, where Margaret Anderson Kelleher was Speaker, Tony Surich was Majority Leader. And they moved the previous question. That was the last time. During that session was the last time that the previous question had been moved in the House. And the reason was, at least from what I can see, is that it's quite a big deal to do that. And you could see how much outrage and consternation it's caused since then, and how sometimes it is sort of Ryan Winkler called it the nuclear option, that this is the way that you really, if like everything is done through relational work between the caucuses, for them to say, we have this agreement about, we're going to have this much time on this bill, have this much done on this, and it's communication between the caucuses that lets that place run smoothly. Without that, you would have the level of interjection, the level of mud throwing, the level of procedural nonsense happening on the floor every day if you didn't have that understanding between the caucuses. And the way to really piss somebody off and screw up that harmony is by throwing a bomb like that, like the previous question, like cutting off debate. So if you do that a couple of times mid-session, any sort of hope or any sort of negotiating position that you have is essentially just blown up. It's done. It's gone. And that's, I think, probably why the hesitancy was there to use those tools until the very end, when it was basically 0 hour and they were going, all right, this isn't happening. We're throwing our hands up. That's the reason. And the fact that the previous question was actually moved this time from a procedural standpoint, the last time that, or one of the last times it was done in 2009, it ended up being around 45 minutes between the time that the previous question was first moved to the time that the bill that it was applying to was finally passed. So just from parliamentary agree, point of order, move to reconsider, all these division, like all this kind of crap that was happening, procedural crap, that it just sort of, it just lights a fuse is kind of the issue with using those tools that can just blow up the entire session and everything that's going on.
Democrats were throwing around the word filibuster. And so a lot of people are probably more familiar with the way the U.S. Senate works and the actual effectiveness of the filibuster. Like nothing comes out of the U.S. Senate, hardly. You can really use a filibuster to stop things. And I feel like it's refreshing for state government to not function that way. I think if you're in the majority and you control the House and the Senate and the governor's office, you probably should be able to get your agenda through. And I hate to say this because we're doing a podcast episode on it, but I don't know that process concerns will dominate the way people are voting in November necessarily. But talk about the filibustering at the state legislature. Was that unprecedented? You talked about how the previous question is kind of a nuclear option procedurally. Was the filibustering this year of a different character than anything in recent years?
I mean, it really was. And, even the DFL, when we've been in the minority, there have been some big bills where the debate has gone on until around 2 in the morning or 4 in the morning. Those are sorts of the flagship pieces of legislation that a majority is trying to move through. And it's, at the end of the day, we know that it's going to pass, or whichever caucuses knows it's going to pass, but they're still going to make their points. And when they have done that, when the DFL has done that, it's been substantive related to the bill. Or it's been amendments that are then being debated relating to the bill. And it's not the same thing over and over again. With conference reports, it's a little bit different. With conference committee reports, you have sort of 3 stages of when it comes back to the House, where you say, first is the question of whether or not it should be adopted. The conference report is adopted. Then the minority will move a motion to reject the conference committee report. So then we'll have open debate on that. And then when that fails, then we go back to the adoption of the conference committee report, and we have open debate on that. And then we finally adopt the conference committee report, and now we're on third reading, final passage as amended by conference. And then we have, again, another string of debate. All of those things can be on the exact same stuff, and you can literally say the exact same thing every single time. And Republicans took full advantage of that. So as terms of the focus of the conversation, that is different. And I know that they were actively working toward that, because what Speaker did is, since she has been Speaker, she's been pretty firm about the House ends at midnight. The House has a rule that says that it should not meet past midnight. In previous sessions, that had been waived pretty routinely. Sometimes the House would gavel in at 3 a.m. and waive it as the first thing. That happened at least once in 2014. And it was done as out of consideration for members that have a long drive home, that shouldn't be staying up late, out of consideration for the staff. And so instead, this year, toward the end of session, Republicans had a game that they were starting to play called Talk Till Midnight. And they would, be sort of high-fiving each other when the House would adjourn at midnight. And they'd table all these bills that they had calendared. That was just the goal, was just to talk it to death. Talk the bills to death. That was until the House adjourns and just waste another day, waste another day, waste another day. That was the game the Republicans are playing. So it wasn't anything to do with, we have points and important things to say about this legislation. We're just trying to stop everything.
Some other commentary I've heard is like, oh, this changes everything. We can't come back from this. It will never be the same again. Is there some truth to that? Are we going to come back next year? I mean, there's no guarantee Democrats will control both houses next time either, so that could change. But like, does this change things in a permanent way, as some people are saying?
I could see it changing things for the short term, but the legislature has rammed through legislation in the past, and it hasn't fundamentally changed the institution. This has been a routine thing for many, many sessions. It actually goes back to the Constitution of the state of Minnesota when it was actually passed. The way that the Constitution was drafted was in two different groups. The Republicans and the Democrats would refuse to meet with one another to draft the Constitution of the state of Minnesota. So they had their own sort of separate groups, and then essentially had a conference committee between them to agree on the forms, and then went back. The process that actually took place for adopting them within the respective groups involved exactly what happened this few weeks ago, where it was rammed through over shouts and protests and all that. It was gaveled through in each place, the Republicans and the Democrats, and was finally put to the people. So this is almost endemic to the way that we do lawmaking in this state. That's sort of, sometimes when things need to get done, then when push comes to shove, that's what happens. I don't know that it necessarily changes things. I think it might change things from a perspective of spurning the majority on a little bit more toward whoever the majority is, toward putting time limits in place. Because, for as much as, Republicans are complaining about DFLers that, oh, this will change everything. Well, imagine their conduct, and how will their conduct now set a precedent for the DFL to just talk about absolutely nothing forever and just waste day after day after day after day and just lie down the tracks and stop them from getting anything done. Maybe that will change things too, but I'm not sure. It just depends on whether the electorate is willing to hold people accountable for getting something done. Because that is the critical piece here. It's what actually did you do with your time, and legislators traditionally and historically have been held accountable on that standard. What projects did you get done for your communities? And if your only goal is to lie down on the tracks and stop anything from happening, stop bonding bills, which is just local investment. Every single bit of a bonding bill is local investment, and you're stopping that from happening. How are your constituents going to feel about that at a certain point?
But I wasn't done talking, and that can't be a reason to not move forward. You could talk forever. So there was, people keep calling the thing at the end a bonding bill. There was no debt taken out. Why do people call that a bonding bill? Isn't it just like a capital investment infrastructure bill? Do you have any understanding of that?
Yeah, that's definitely the much more proper term for it. It's essentially funding things that a bonding bill would normally fund, but you're correct. It was just cash, and so there wasn't any constitutional requirement for a 60% majority to adopt it.
And that is that's the casualty of the obstruction, the going up to the deadline, because that failed by like 30 seconds. And I watched that play out after the 25 minutes of shouting. It was right. The 25 minutes of shouting happened. And then Champion is waiting for people to like not shout anymore. And he goes back and forth with some Republican about something. And they decide whether they still like each other, and they can like personal drama going on between the two guys. And does Champion not have a clock right there that's like, you only have this much time to finish your business? It seems like a real big problem that he just kind of like wasted those final minutes there, knowing that midnight is the deadline. Did Champion mismanage that situation?
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened with that. I mean, I don't know if you could hear it on the recording. You can just vaguely make out Ann Russ going, "Close the roll!"
Close the roll.
Did you direct me to close it? Yeah.
I directed you to close the roll. Mr. President, you called it already. You said it was called. It was past midnight. You said it. You cannot close the roll after midnight.
It was done after midnight when the last one was done, so it does not pass.
And I heard from another senator that we couldn't see because the camera was over the voting board. What we couldn't see was that it sounds like he may have frozen, sort of, from just the wall of noise that was coming at him, that he didn't move through it fast enough to get that done. And to me, like, that's a big risk. You have to be an exceptionally steady chair and presiding officer to move through that and to be able to withstand that. I mean, even Speaker Horman, who was very, very experienced in the chair, even struggled sometimes to, know what the next step was and had to confer with the chief clerk a couple of times. So that's understandable, but like, you got to be ready for that. If that's the step you're going to take, it's not just another day at the office. You got to be 100% ready and prepared and practiced for whatever comes your way, to know exactly what you're going to say next, what's going to happen now, what's the next step, and just be on it. And then there's also the remote voting, I think, was dragging things out just a little bit too. The way that they do the remote voting in the Senate, there were still a handful of members that were voting remotely, and I think they try to get through that as quickly as possible. But there were a couple of times there where it's like, this pause is taking just a bit too long. We should just move it through.
There were some big Minneapolis items in there. There was the funding for Minneapolis Public Works to create the water yard someplace else so that the Roof Depot deal can go through. North Commons Park. I think there's a bridge over Minnehaha Creek, and I think the Nicollet Avenue Bridge that lost funding, a bunch of stuff, some funding for Avivo. So it's kind of a big deal that didn't go through.
It does kind of speak to the necessity of procedure, though. I mean, I did, like I said earlier, I have my copy of Mason's here, which is one of the parliamentary authorities that the legislature uses, and Pat Murphy, the chief clerk, actually signed it for me and said, love that you're interested in process and procedure. It matters. And
Wait,
it does matter.
Who signed that? Who signed that?
The chief clerk of the House.
Okay.
And because it does matter. This shows very, very fundamentally how being confident in how the rules and procedure work, how the rules are supposed to be operated, how the chair works, how the presiding officer works in a legislative body, that matters fundamentally. That because of small things that were done along the way, small, errors or slowness or delays in the handling of the process in those last couple of minutes is the difference between $90 million of public investment in local projects happening and it not happening. It really does matter.
Yeah. Is there anything, I want to ask you some like DFL convention stuff here at the end, but before we move on, is there anything about the end of session or the session in general that like you came here wanting to talk about that we haven't gotten to?
Just kind of briefly, I mean, with the way that the rules work in the House and the Senate is that each House under the Constitution has the authority to set its own rules and procedure and elect its own presiding officer. So I think that people are often confused about how the rules operate there, and that how something can still like be considered to have been fairly passed, even when presumably certain rules were violated in order to get there. And the reason is simply that the Constitution delegates that authority over rules and procedure in legislation to each legislative body. And it's that body's determination that a bill is legally passed that's given by a majority of the members voting for it. That when that happens and the presiding officer signs off on it, that House has basically said that this bill is legally passed. Through whatever procedures that we set, we're basically just choosing to move it through and say this is done. That's why the courts have said that whenever something like this has happened in the past, there have been questions asked, did this bill legally pass? And the courts have basically just said, yeah, it's fine. If the legislature says it's good, it's good. So each legislative body sets its own rules and is the authority and the judge of its own proceedings. That's where it has this authority to do the things that happened through what happened at the end of session and still pass legislation even under those conditions.
Rules are just a guideline. You make up the rules as you go along is the uncharitable way to phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing. So there's this rule, is it called the single subject? Is that a rule or a law?
It is a clause in the Constitution that says laws shall embrace only one subject.
This scares me a little, but like, how safe is that people call it the megabus, the omnibus full of other omnibuses? Like, how safe is that from a legal challenge, do you think, under that single subject provision?
I think it's very safe on a number of fronts. One, like I said, the courts will sort of defer to the legislature, have basically said that exact clause is meaningless virtually on a number of different occasions. The DFL did something similar in 2014 with the supplemental budget bill. It was a single bill that was just all of the supplemental financing for the state. And the single subject was money for the state, essentially.
Right.
That is the single subject that's out there. And especially with tax bills historically, too, it just happened to be a tax conference committee. Tax bills are historically the last thing that happens in session. And so legislators will often move floor amendments that would probably not be germane under normal circumstances, but can be taken up and often get slotted in there because of that precedent, because the last thing is the last chance to get anything through. So, the single subject rule is, one, virtually meaningless according to the courts, and two, there's so much precedent out there from both the legislature and the court perspective that this is fine.
Because I've been traumatized by legal wrangling over the 2040 plan. I don't want the mega omnibus bill containing the 2040 plan fix to also be subject to endless legal wrangling.
Well, the good thing about that is that the legislature is a law-making body, or lawmaking bodies. They're not law-taking bodies, whereas the city of Minneapolis is a creature of the state. The state is sort of the primary authority when it comes to constitutional law. So it gets a lot more deference than, for example, the city would, and a lot less subject to legal challenge.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So let's talk about some DFL convention stuff, because as I said, you seem to chair every Senate district convention I go to. I went to the CD5 convention recently. You were chairing that one. And my question is, why do you do that? Do you get paid for that?
I wish I got paid for it. It's just for the love of the game, if you will. I've been interested in parliamentary procedure for quite some time. When I was in youth and government in high school, or actually middle school, I went for the first time in 7th grade to the Model United Nations conference that the local YMCA puts on. And I was just like bowled over, like, wow, I have no idea what anyone is saying here. Everyone's saying, motion this, vote that, second this, and all that. I had zero clue what was going on and how any of it worked. I think I said 2 words the entire conference. The next year, though, I decided to come back and be much more attentive to what do the rules say and how are these things working. They have the table of basic motions, and I just tried to study that as best as I could to understand how that process worked. And that was kind of the first sort of beginning of it. And then I started going to DFL conventions. Like I said, I went to my first precinct caucus in 2006. I went to my first Senate district convention in 2008. And I helped out as a timekeeper there, but I got to see that process up close and personal, and went to the state convention that year and then in 2012, and got to see how each of these things worked, how each of these processes worked. And it was really fascinating for me to see how just ordinary people could come to a place like this, have their voice heard, make a proposal, and then have the body vote, and then that dictates what happens for that local unit, for that party unit, or for the state party, that this is the position that we take. And to see the process kind of play out like that, it just felt just fascinating personally. So it's kind of the same reason that I've gotten to observe the legislature and got into that. But I remember getting involved at the 2014 convention, the first one I went to as a delegate, and the way that one sort of played out, I was pretty active on the floor, especially on the second day. One of the chairs there I didn't think did a particularly good job that I was a fan of, and so I asked Ken Martin the next time I saw him, I'm like, how do I get to do that? Because I feel like I could do a better job than that. I've been involved in congressional debate in high school, which involves presiding too. I was like, I could do a better job than that. And he said, well, become a certified parliamentarian. So I started studying. Then came back after college and started going around to different conventions with different people, joining them and helping out wherever I could, and just kind of getting exposed to all these different opportunities. And then just have been involved in making myself available to different units since then. So that's kind of how I got started with that, and how I've been consistent with it. And that's just a little bit about why it interests me.
How hard is it to become a certified parliamentarian? Is everyone who runs a DFL convention as the chair is a certified parliamentarian?
No. So we do have a process in the DFL Constitution and the DFL Party Affairs to be a certified convention chair. That's something the Party Affairs team has been working on debut more recently. You have to have at least one of the convention chairs at any convention has gone through that certification. The certification is fairly simple. It's meant to be usable by any organizing unit leader. There are plenty of county units and small local units around the state that just need somebody who can kind of know what the rules are, or the local unit chair should know what the rules are and how to run a meeting, just to, chair their convention of maybe a few dozen people who show up to just go through their party business and endorse any candidates they have, just to get it done, because you need to hold a few hundred of those every year or every 2 years. That's kind of who it's built for. It's kind of built for a more general audience. So it would make you a good enough chair to know kind of what's supposed to happen when. But as far as sort of the more complicated conventions like you and I have been to, that's when having a lot more experience at those, getting to know what is the precedent within the party, how do these things actually work, what are these more complex scenarios, that's when you want to get more advanced. There are parliamentarian certifications that are offered by a couple of different national institutions, the National Association of Parliamentarians and the American Institute of Parliamentarians. Those ones are much more significant credentials that our pal Josh Martin happens to carry one of those credentials as a professional registered parliamentarian through the National Association of Parliamentarians.
Is he a more credentialed parliamentarian than you?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Congratulations,
I just
Josh
got
Martin.
membership in the organization, so I passed my membership exam a week or so ago for the National Association, and that one's a very simple exam that's tested on Robert's Rules in brief, and I'm hoping to study up to the registered parliamentarian and professional registered parliamentarian credentials.
I'm starting to realize, many of my recent guests are parliamentarians, and I don't know if that's a good direction for this podcast to go in.
Now you see Julie Blaha on.
Yeah. So what does it mean when someone goes up to the microphone at a convention, one of the delegates is like, point of order. And they seem to think that means I can just talk forever and you must do what I say. All I have to do is say the magic words, point of order, and you have to do what I say. That can't be true. Why do they think that? What does point of order really mean? How do people use it appropriately?
Yeah, so point of order, there are a couple of things that you can request on the mic that can sort of interrupt things. a point of order is one of them. A point of order is essentially an allegation that a rule has been broken and requires correction by the chair. So it's essentially point of order under Rule 15 or under the agenda. This should be our next item of business, not this. And the chair would say the point is well taken or the point is not well taken. And then if they feel like explaining it, they can explain that too, and then either make the correction or order the correction to be made or something like that. That's a point of order. That's a properly made point of order. Points of personal privilege, I think, are the ones that get on my nerves the most. That's the one that I think people think the personal privilege is the privilege to get up and say something. No, that's not what that is. Questions of privilege is what the actual definition is, come in two forms: question of personal privilege or question of privilege affecting the assembly. Personal privilege is something that is affecting you and your rights as a member specifically. So this would be somebody who's made charges against your character personally. Older versions of Roberts have said that if those charges were true, would invalidate your ability to be a member of that organization. For example, this person said I was a Republican. I am not a Republican. I have never been a Republican, something like that. That would actually be a question of personal privilege. Anything else about the heating, about the sound, about the business before, or about the nature of the assembly, that is the question of privilege affecting the assembly. Those ones should be used more often and should be used to draw attention to things that do affect people's ability to participate and affect the ability of the group to get its business done. But nowhere in there and nowhere under Roberts is there, I got something to say, especially when it's, I want to, gripe about something that we already did and already debated and already took a vote on, and I want to say how upset I am about that. That's not allowed. And the reason is because we need to get through business. This is a deliberative assembly. It's not just a get-together where people have some feelings about things. When we're doing a convention, hundreds of people potentially have taken time out of their day, out of their weekend, to sit in a gym or sit in a high school theater and go through the party's business. That's what our task needs to be, and that's what the task needs to stay on. And when you deviate from that because someone wants to say something, it detracts from the entire experience for everybody. So I know some chairs are more forgiving and more lenient with that. I don't personally tolerate a whole lot of extended discussion without something before us.
Yeah, there was one convention where a guy at the beginning was like, I want a new chair. And I wanted to vacate the chair. And I couldn't did that guy have a personal grudge against you? Why did he want to remove you his chair? I can't imagine showing up to a convention and thinking, well, the first thing I need to do here is vacate the chair.
And it was something minor, and what I wish he had done is raise it as a question of privilege affecting the assembly, because he had said, or a point of order, to say, because I had said that we wouldn't, or the credentials chair had said that we wouldn't do substantive business before upgrading was done. We had adopted the rules in the agenda, and so he was saying that I had broken that word, and that we voted on a chair. And I was trying to say that I would have responded and someone else raised that question, and so I did get the chance to address it. The fact is that upgrading happens throughout the convention. We can't sit on our hands and wait for that to be done before we even, proceed with business. We have to get work done. Otherwise, we'd be here for hours. So there are some things that we didn't. The fact is we accomplished that. We didn't take a vote on the Minneapolis City chair election until the alternates had been seated. That was how that happened. But he decided to start with a motion to vacate the chair, which again is a very significant and serious motion to make. But I wish he had just made his point. And I don't. It's not like I don't. I do know who that is at this point, and I want to reach out to him because something else happened at another convention that we were at, and and there are a lot of times that he's pretty correct, but I do want to, there are a couple things that we need to be correct about how we do these things, and some correction in our understanding will help us so that you don't take what I do personally. That's kind of the biggest thing that that I don't want to have happen at any convention I'm running is that anyone thinks that anything that I do has anything to do with anyone personally. It's not about that. It's about this is what the rules say, and this is how we need to officially move through business.
So imagine some people in dark suits show up. They get out of an SUV wherever you happen to be, and they're like, "Dan, we need to recruit you for like an elite team of parliamentarians to go to one of our enemy countries and disrupt one of their conventions. What is the most effective way to weaponize the rules? Let's assume that this other country is also using Robert's rules." Mm-hmm. How do we weaponize the rules to defeat our enemies? What do we do? What's your worst nightmare?
If you can get the group to go along with you, that's the biggest thing. I think whatever you can do to get the group to question their confidence in the chair is probably the best. Like, if you really want to disrupt things, that's how you do it. If the group has confidence in the chair, that the chair is simply trying to move through things, and these people are just disrupting needlessly, they're going to side with the chair, and they will do that 9 times out of 10. For that other one time, you need to essentially have the chair be kind of off of their game and not be solid and not be sort of resolved that this is how we're doing things and this is why we're doing things, because without that, someone who may be light on sleep may resort to personal insults in response to motions or points of order, and then that will immediately turn the room against you. So if you can do that through points made about questions of privilege, that's one way to do it. If you have the group on your side and you have the group adhering to Roberts strictly, there are procedures in Roberts to unseat the chair or to overturn rulings of the chair without the chair's action. And there's actually a thing that you can do where you raise a point of order, and if the chair doesn't call on you, or you don't are not allowed to say your point of order, you just state it aloud. Essentially, it's the 3-time rule. Either it's an appeal or a point of order or a motion to vacate. And after making the motion or making the point of order, the appeal 3 times, you can then put the question yourself. And you from the audience can say, shall the decision of the chair stand at the judgment of the body, or, shall the chair be vacated? All those in favor say aye, those opposed say no, and you can do that from the audience, which is scary, and I've never seen that happen, but that is a tool that is allowed under Roberts for a group to retake control from a rogue chair, if you will.
So as a person who runs these political conventions, do you feel protective of them? Do you feel like you want to defend them from critics who say, well, these take all day, they're anti-democratic, look at all the older white people who show up, they're not representative? Do you feel like it's a good process?
I do, and I think that, I had some high schoolers that I was meeting with, some members of the high school Democrats group in Eastridge High School in Woodbury, because they were helping out at the SD47 convention that I was at, and I kind of got to talk to them the week before the convention to go through, all right, here's what happens, here's what our orders of business are, this is what this item of business looks like, this is what the purpose of that is. And after explaining that, they were all like blown away. They were like, wow, I had no idea that there was an opportunity for just a regular ordinary person to show up somewhere, get elected, and then participate at this grassroots level and make decisions that impact the party, that impact who our candidates are, that impact how a major political party does its organizing work in our local communities, and have that drive it. And I think that that's something that's lost in a lot of different states. The reason that our Constitution and our party is so big is because a lot of people participate in it and are willing to hold people accountable to those rules. Most states don't have that. Most states just have a few pages, if anything, and then they probably don't follow it very much. We have such a robust party process here because the grassroots gets that representation. If there wasn't an opportunity for folks to show up and to make their voices heard and to then elect representatives to higher conventions to represent their views, then you wouldn't have nearly the attention that candidates pay to those folks. and that's probably the biggest argument for the caucus process, is that it is an opportunity for someone without a whole lot of resources, who can't buy a ton of media, who can't buy a ton of mailers, to show up at precinct caucuses or introduce themselves to 300 or so delegates by calling people, by showing up at their door, by inviting them to conversations, things like that, where they can talk about those issues on a more deep and personal level. And those folks are not just randos who kind of come out of the woodwork and fall out of nothing. Those people are elected representatives of their neighbors. So they come there with a particular set of priorities and with things that are generated from the grassroots up. So it's a much more open process that allows us to elect more quality candidates. I'll say this, the 2023 legislative session that we had would not have happened without the precinct caucus convention process. If we didn't have that, we would be beholden, in my view, to the highest bidder within our party and within our candidates. But the fact that we have a caucus process and official party support, which has significant resources to offer to any candidate, including things like the Voter Action Network, the voter file, which is a vital resource that smaller candidates and campaigns can buy into. Without that, we'd be able to just have big money interests come in and just run the show. And the priorities of the people that elect those folks and organize around those priorities wouldn't get done.
Well, point of order, Dan Thomas-Commins, because you referred to delegates as elected representatives of their neighbors. Mm-hmm. And I was a delegate this year at a convention, and I'm just a guy who filled out a non-attendee form. I don't consider that being elected representative of my neighbors.
You were elected. I filled out non-attendee forms, and I've not gotten elected to positions. So it just depends on what the interest is at that level. But there are plenty of times when folks will go to caucus for a particular candidate, and you have contested delegate elections, and so then you have to elect them proportionally to folks' candidate preference. And then that way you have that represented from the grassroots. Which candidate can turn out their supporters to go to caucuses and say, this is who we want the party to support. That does have its own, we have proportional representation that can be demanded by a small number of folks to say, we're going to make sure that our delegates to the next highest convention accurately represent our candidate preference and the issues that we care about. There are processes within our party constitution for that, and that's the purpose that it serves. So they are elected representatives, even if there was no contest.
Yeah. I hope Mike Norton is very upset by the way we're ending this. Norton, if you're listening, former Minneapolis DFL vice chair, who has gone on to be very angry, does a lot of angry tweets about how terrible the DFL endorsement process, all these conventions and caucuses, he hates it. He was once an insider, and now he's sniping from the outside.
The Ward 7 convention in 2023 was run from his office, so, he's one to talk.
That convention led to some good things, I think. So, Mike Norton, shame on you. Do you have any recommendations, Dan? It doesn't have to necessarily be related to rules. What are you enjoying lately?
Oh goodness. When I finally finished the umpteen different versions of the CBRC State Convention report that's coming up next weekend, there are a couple of different versions that I'm working on right now. When that's done, I hope to kick back and lounge around with a couple of video games that have been sitting in my Steam library for quite some time. So
let's hear them.
Hitman is the most recent acquisition. There's a Portal mod out there that I wanted to finish, and then Horizon Forbidden West is out too on PC, so I'm looking to get into that. I think I sunk 200 hours into Horizon Zero Dawn.
Okay. I never quite finished the Hitman trilogy. I need to go back to it. I got through the first two. I bought it as a bundle. I need to finish that final one.
I did make a good meme about Josh Martin being a hired parliamentarian to be sort of clandestine and giving parliamentary advice from the sidelines, and managed to superimpose his glasses onto the Hitman character, Agent 47, and sub out a picture of him holding a gun with him holding a gavel. So I think he enjoyed that.
Josh Martin is famously completely bald-headed. I don't know if he shaves it. I don't know if he must shave some of it, but really takes it down to the skin, just like that video game character. Very menacing, Josh Martin.
Have you ever actually, he's only been facing forward on this podcast. Have you ever actually looked at the back of his head to see if there's a barcode back there?
Yeah, Josh Martin probably has an assassin's barcode, like from the video game Hitman, on the back of his head. I'm going to ask him in the next episode that he must turn around so we can see the back of his head. Well, thank you, Dan, for joining me to talk about process for an hour. I hope people enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, John, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, this has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.